Hello, Bitcoiners. Mark Berger here, your Bitcoin consultant and advisor. I wanted to give an update about the executive action, the executive order that came out of the White House late on Thursday night, creating a Bitcoin strategic reserve and a digital asset stockpile. And I think this was great news, but the market does not seem to agree with me at the moment because Bitcoin is down about 5% since that announcement. So, what gives if we have created a Bitcoin strategic reserve, as I have anticipated ever since the election of Donald Trump in November 6th? Why has the price gone down? And it is my hypothesis that people simply do not understand this executive action, and they are confusing this executive order with the Bitcoin Act, which is in Congress right now, specifically in the Senate Banking Committee, being shepherded along by Senator Cynthia Lummis. So let me explain, because I'm in a pretty good position to be able to sort this out for you. Almost immediately after I graduated college a long time ago, I worked in the United States Senate as a legislative assistant. And I have a pretty good idea of actually how the government works, the United States federal government works. So let me explain it to you, because I know I have Canadian clients and clients in Europe as well. And even if you're an American, this stuff isn't very clear. So executive action cannot authorize, or should I say, executive orders cannot authorize any new spending of American taxpayer funds. Only the Congress can authorize and appropriate new spending for whatever it deems necessary. And it authorizes money for defense. It authorizes money for education, for healthcare, and for anything else that it you know that it the representatives deem as appropriate. The executive branch of the government, the president, can then control when that money is spent and other little details about the execution of those money orders, so to speak, that come from Congress. But the executive branch, the president, cannot actually go out and buy new things that have not been authorized and appropriated by the Congress. So when this executive order came out, there was no explicit um, instructions for the executive branch to buy new Bitcoin. It does set up a strategic Bitcoin reserve using Bitcoin that have been seized by the executive branch's Department of Justice in its enforcement of the laws. In other words, criminals who were caught by the Federal Justice Department, by the FBI and other agencies. Criminals were caught with Bitcoin in their possession. So first, the government will try to restore victims of criminal activity. If they have lost Bitcoin, they'll try to give them back their Bitcoin. But in the majority of cases, assets are seized and they can't return them, or they don't know who it belongs to, who is stolen from. And in some cases, criminals simply may earned Bitcoin in their criminal activity. So there really is, it's very hard to trace or actually to account for where this Bitcoin came from. So the government has accumulated a large number of Bitcoin. Some estimates have it at about 200,000 Bitcoin in the federal government's possession through this asset seizure and forfeiture provisions from the Department of Justice. So this strategic Bitcoin reserve is going to take all of that Bitcoin that has been seized from criminal activity and put it into this strategic Bitcoin reserve. That's all it does. So there's really no new net buying. However, it's very positive for Bitcoin, this strategic Bitcoin reserve, because first of all, it is not going to contain any altcoins, which many of us call shit coins. It's only going to be Bitcoin. And not only that will it only be Bitcoin, but the president has authorized the Secretary of the Commerce, Secretary of Commerce, and the Secretary of the Treasury to come up with new creative ways for how the executive branch may acquire more Bitcoin in order to put into the strategic Bitcoin reserve. That would be entirely budget neutral. That would, in other words, wouldn't require any new spending or taxes on us to get the Bitcoin into the reserve. So there are a number of creative ways that the government, or at least the president, can add to the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Now, I'll suggest a few of them which have been brought up. So, for instance, the United States is still on the books for the price of gold being 30, or actually it's now $42, I think, or $45 an ounce, which is a price that was established, I think, when Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971. So supposedly the United States government has 8,000 tons of gold, but it's only marked on the books at $45, let's say. If all of a sudden the government declared that now gold was not worth $45, but instead was worth a more reasonable and accurate market price of, say, $2,900 or $3,000 an ounce, all of a sudden the federal government would see a windfall of many, many, many billions of dollars. I don't know how many billions. I think it might be $70 billion. So the executive branch could then realize that gain of $70 billion and just through accounting, take that $70 billion and buy Bitcoin with it. And it wouldn't need any congressional approval whatsoever. So that's one way. Another way is to simply sell federal assets. Trump and the Doge team have already recommended selling hundreds of federal buildings around the country that are not being used or being not used to their highest use. So they recommend getting rid of these buildings. That would raise several more billions of dollars. So there are many ways that the executive branch could find money to buy more Bitcoin in the future. And the executive order explicitly gives this order to find creative ways to buy more Bitcoin to put into this strategic Bitcoin reserve. Not only that, the executive order explicitly says that no Bitcoin will be sold in the future. In other words, this is something that is just going to accumulate. We're only going to add to the Bitcoin reserve. We're not going to take anything out of it. So that's extremely bullish for the price of Bitcoin. Now, the second thing that this executive order did was it created a digital assets stockpile. Okay. So what is the difference between the strategic Bitcoin reserve and the digital asset stockpile? Well, the digital asset stockpile will contain everything except Bitcoin. In other words, it will contain all of the altcoins and all of the shitcoins that the government has accumulated through the Department of Justice's criminal enforcement actions. So Ethereum, Doge, Solana, XRP, any other, shitcoin that it's accumulated over the years will go into this digital stockpile. But not only that, this digital stockpile can be liquidated at any time, as opposed to the Bitcoin strategic reserve, which cannot be sold. So the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of Commerce could actually sell all of those other digital assets and trade it for Bitcoin and put it in the Bitcoin strategic reserve. So extremely bullish for Bitcoin. And I don't think people quite understand the ramifications of this. And if you do, you should be even more excited about Bitcoin now than before this happened. So we still have the Bitcoin Act in the Senate Banking Committee. Now, this act would authorize a total of 1 million Bitcoin being put into the Bitcoin strategic reserve that has now been created. And in order to fill that strategic Bitcoin reserve, it would authorize the spending of taxpayer money. It would actually take taxpayer money and put it into Bitcoin. Now, that is a much harder thing to create because it requires congressional approval. And the lawmaking process is quite complicated and it's slow and it requires consensus and there's politics involved. Well, anyway, it's very difficult to get laws actually created in the United States. And that's the way the system was designed. You had to get House approval, you had to get Senate approval, and then you had to reconcile the two bills. Often there are differences between the two, so you have to reconcile them. And then you have to have another vote in each house on the reconciliation bill. And then if those if those bills pass the House and the Senate, then it goes to the president for final signature or a veto and gets rejected. But In this case, the Bitcoin Act would get signed by the president, of course. There's almost no doubt about that. So that's a much longer process. But in the meantime, we have a number of positive drivers that will drive Bitcoin's adoption around the world and from governments. So we now have a Bitcoin strategic reserve in the United States. And Bitcoin and the United States is now a leader in Bitcoin. I don't know of really any other Bitcoin strategic reserve except in El Salvador. That country has been buying 1 Bitcoin a day for the last 2.5 years or something like that. And Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert have been advising the president, Bukele of El Salvador, to do this. So they have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. But El Salvador is a tiny country, 6 million people or something like that. Very small GDP, not really a lot of money. But now the United States, the largest economy in the world, the most powerful country in the world, has a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Whoa, this is big news. What do you think all the other countries in the world are now thinking about? Maybe we should have a Bitcoin strategic reserve, particularly the countries that have money sitting around. All of the Gulf states, any of the oil producing countries, China, which sends all of its export gains, all of the money that it makes in trade around the world, it generally buys treasury bonds and bonds of other countries. I would think they would now be very interested in buying Bitcoin and not even wait around for America to pass its Bitcoin Act to buy more Bitcoin. So I think this is the start of the race. The gun has just gone off of this race for countries to buy Bitcoin. And this is enormous. I mean, when I got into Bitcoin, it was just little old people like me buying Bitcoin, getting a few Bitcoin here and there. Uh, and then it moved from there to, to companies buying Bitcoin. And MicroStrategy now has almost 500,000 Bitcoin in its treasury. And now other companies, ever since MicroStrategy adopted this Bitcoin strategy, by the way, it changed its name to Strategy B, a Bitcoin strategy company. Ever since MicroStrategy did this, we've seen all sorts of companies adopt a similar strategy around the world. MetaPlanet in Japan has also adopted this Bitcoin strategy, and other companies are buying Bitcoin instead of holding cash in their balance sheets. So now we have the United States with a strategic Bitcoin reserve. We're going to see countries, I think, around the world, Gulf states, announce that they are acquiring Bitcoin as well. And when countries get into the game of buying Bitcoin, it's huge. It's enormous. And not only is this an enormous price push when countries get into it, but when other countries start to buy Bitcoin, it gives even more confidence for their citizens to buy Bitcoin, knowing that their governments are basically endorsing the ownership of Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is not a speculative asset anymore. Bitcoin is a safe haven asset all of a sudden, which is a huge reversal from the last 10 to 12 years when Bitcoin was considered a risky asset, a speculative asset, something that could go to zero one day. But now that we have the United States holding Bitcoin, we have basically a guarantee from the United States that Bitcoin is not going to go to zero because they're not selling. That's what the executive order says. They are not permitted to sell Bitcoin. And in fact, they've been ordered, the president has ordered its cabinet to look for other creative ways to buy Bitcoin. So we have a buyer of last resort now in the federal government of the United States. So just a huge shift in the tides of Bitcoin, uh, which is like the ETF that was launched, the many ETFs that were launched in 23, in February of 23, 2 years ago. We had the endorsement of Wall Street to buy Bitcoin. BlackRock, the largest ETF provider in the world, the largest financial services company in the world, endorsed Bitcoin by offering an ETF. And that happened 2 years ago. And what did we see after the announcement of the ETF? Bitcoin went from 30,000 to 70,000 in a month or two. So the fact that Bitcoin now on Saturday afternoon, March 8th, is at $86,000, 582, I think it's a real opportunity if you understand what I'm talking about here. A real opportunity, a real buying opportunity if you want to add to your stash or if you want to finally, get in Bitcoin. Or even better, if you're holding any of these altcoins, get rid of them and trade them for Bitcoin because that's exactly what the United States government is going to be doing. They're going to be trading their Ethereum, their 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 Solana, their whatever all that garbage, centralized private garbage is, and they're going to be trading it for Bitcoin. So you should do the same. So I do not give financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor, but I am going to be looking to buy Bitcoin because of this news. And anyone who understands about this executive action that just happened Thursday night should do so as well. So best of luck. And if you have any questions, please contact me through my website at bitcoinconsultant.us or on Twitter. My direct messages are open. I am at mburger47. Please contact me there. And I'm happy to help you take sovereign control of your Bitcoin and become free in your financial life through Bitcoin by helping you take possession of your Bitcoin, which is the best use of Bitcoin is as a savings vehicle, a long-term savings vehicle. And I've helped dozens of people over the years become financially free and sovereign with Bitcoin. So I look forward to hearing from you, and let's huddle on. All right, now have a good weekend.